Very special guest joining us today. With us is Professor Maurice Stucke, who's a Douglas A. Blaze Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Tennessee. He has also been an official in the U.S. administration. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. And let me begin by asking you about the biggest concern today in the digital age. We're talking about AI and its influence growing. One of the concerns that's expressed very often is a need for privacy, particularly in the digital era. How important is this issue to begin with, and what are some of the concerns?
Oh, one thing, when I testified before the Senate, I don't often do that. So I was thinking, what sort of message could I leave with our senators? And the key message that I thought was that AI will only exacerbate the legislative deficits to date. So if you don't have a good privacy measure, AI is going to then make it worse. In the United States, we haven't updated our competition laws in over 100 years. We don't have a nationwide privacy law, and AI will just make that worse on several different levels. Now, there are significant benefits from AI, but the concerns from AI are, one is going to be that AI, the foundation models that we rely on today, require vast amounts of data. So even though you may not know it, that data is being scraped today from all of these public websites about you. The other implication is that little bits of information that you may not think that are that significant can then be collected and then create a picture about you. So it's almost like the painter George Seurat, if you know him, that Sunday in the Park with George. If you look at the painting very closely, you only see individual dots, but when you stand back, you see this emerging picture, and that's with AI. It will be able to identify your sexual preferences, your health, many intimate details from seemingly benign information. And the third is that the information just doesn't sit with AI. It's the concern now with social media, when there's an incentive then to use that data to addict you, to get you to buy things that you otherwise might not have been interested in purchasing at the highest price that you're willing to pay. So it's a collection of data, the inferences that can be made about you, and then the use of that information, and not always ways that are beneficial for the individual.
But this is, of course, a very important thing that you're talking about from the aspect of how it can be commercially exploited. Are there concerns of how governments can potentially misuse this data as well?
Oh, absolutely. So you have then the concerns about surveillance by the government, or you have large firms then having that effective sort of surveillance as well. And then what's then the relationship between the two of them? That's also of significant concern.
Right. So what can be done to safeguard against this kind of misuse in your view?
Well, you can't put AI back in the box, right? So the belief right now is, how can we get the benefits of AI? And AIs can have tremendous benefits while mitigating the risks. So if you just look, for example, I have this smartwatch that collects all of this health data about me from Garmin, and it's wonderful. But think about the insights that we can have on our health with being able to detect if I'm at risk of a stroke or of a heart attack. There are and when I talk about AI back in my home university, they talk about how it can have this equalizing effect, that it can enable surgeons that are more junior to get the sort of 3D perspective that a more veteran surgeon can have through experience. So there are so many tremendous benefits of AI, but then how do we then mitigate the risks? And there's not one tool. There's not going to be one tool. But one of the things that I talk about is eliminating times when the incentives are not aligned with the user's incentives. And that would be like behavioral advertising. So giving individuals the right to say, I don't want to have behavioral advertising. I want to be able to opt out of that. And then also being able to opt out of personalization if they so desire. Those are some of the basic safeguards that we can have while still getting some of the benefits of AI.
Yeah, but that's actually a very interesting area, because there are certain platforms, softwares, apps, where if you refuse to accept their terms and conditions when it comes to privacy or data collection, you might not be able to use that particular application. So how do we build that into the legal framework? Are there adequate laws to actually do all of that?
This is, so we have the GDPR, but behavioral advertising is as popular in Europe as it is in the United States, where we don't have the GDPR. So what's going on here? And the fact the biggest action to date has been by the German Competition Authority against Facebook. I think we're heading there. And so what's going to happen is that AI is now taking behavioral advertising up a notch. So if you look at Meta, or even like the Yum, which manufacturers like Pizza Hut, Burger King, they're all using now AI for behavioral advertising to tailor messages for individuals. So you're going to get a special promotion, but it's not just a special promotion, it's going to find out what sort of promotional angle can get you to buy more pizza. And you might think, well, pizza, that's not that bad. But when you have gambling apps doing the same, with people struggling with gambling addictions, that's problematic. I think what's going to happen, and you're starting to see this more in Europe, and this is what the German Competition Authority is, to give individuals a choice and to say, I don't want behavioral advertising. So you can still get advertising, but it's not going to be based on all of the data that's collected about you, not only on that platform, but every other platform that you visited.
Right. How is this going to impact the field of manufacturing in your view? In India, for instance, about 17% of its GDP is from manufacturing. There are millions who are employed in labor-intensive industries, but with generative AI coming in, talking about supply chains and all of that, how do we ensure that we best use technology and at the same time also ensure that this efficiency doesn't come at the cost of jobs and livelihoods for many?
Yeah, you ask any American parent who has kids going to college, is how do we AI-proof our children so that our children are not going to go headlong into a career that is going to be obliterated 20, 30 years from now. That is the major disruption. We don't know. We're still, and the scary part about AI is that it's not going to affect just the sort of blue-collar jobs. It's going to affect a lot of white-collar jobs that formerly paid really well, like accounting, computer engineering. There was this article about AI in finance, and then they were pointing out like a lot of areas of finance are going to be eliminated as well. So in the short answer is AI can have tremendous. There's actually two components to that. AI can have tremendous upside on manufacturing. But then what you want to avoid is having the supply chain too brittle, like what we saw in COVID, where there's not a sufficient amount of redundancy in the supply chain, that if it becomes too lean, then if it's subject to a shock, that could have really disastrous effects. And then the impact on labor, that's the trillion-dollar question.
Absolutely. And one of the big concerns that we see coming out of AI is this huge proliferation of deep fakes. And once it goes on social media, it gets totally viral. There's been several cases here where celebrities have had their morphed deep fakes, which, there are all sorts of complicated situations that arise out of them. But how would you be able to tell our viewers what are the best ways that a user can perhaps try and identify a deep fake so that one does not get fooled by it or swayed by it?
That's another pressing issue. In the U.S. courts now, I teach evidence as one of my classes, and that's an issue that courts are struggling with as well, is how do you authenticate a photo to show that it is what it purports to be? And until we get to some sort of national watermarking standard, where you can have a watermark that will lend credibility, that's going to be a concern. And when you think about the earlier point I mentioned about behavioral advertising, and then you add deep fakes to that, the Wall Street Journal ran a series of stories about Facebook and how they uncovered information about how Meta was aware that its algorithm was creating social discord, particularly here in India. And then you add That's just from the algorithm promoting contentious content. Then if you add deepfakes to that, it then is going to potentially lead to greater social unrest.
Absolutely. Also, while we are discussing the topic of AI, let me also get into some of the antitrust challenges that you foresee as far as development and deployment of generative AI and this particular technology is concerned.
There's really there's four overarching questions. One of them is, what's the relationship between competition policy, privacy, and consumer protection? Then the second is, how will AI affect each of them? How will AI affect competition? How will it affect privacy and consumer protection? Then third is, how will AI change the relationship among the three? And then fourth, what can countries do? Not only individually, but then globally, because the internet has no borders. Just looking at the competition angle alone, the concern now is, will AI disrupt GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Meta? Or will GAFAM be able to co-opt AI to expand their ecosystems? That's the issue that competition officials are looking at. Right now, what you have is this AI supply chain, AI foundation model supply chain. And if each layer of the supply chain were unconcentrated, had many competitors, and no competitor operated on multiple levels, then you can have multiple foundation models and a very vibrant AI supply chain. The problem and the concern is that a few companies are now starting to dominate the AI foundation model supply chain. There's dominating the data level, the compute level, and the foundation model level. And once that supply chain becomes concentrated, that could have significant anti-competitive effects going forward on innovation. That's the concern among competition officials today.
Right. But is that actually happening? Do you see that practically happening in terms of whether corporations are actually sort of using their own role in terms of the data advantages to stifle competition? Is that happening on ground?
Yes. It's still very much in the early levels, but my co-author and I, when we did our preliminary investigation, one thing that we found is that you can use these foundation models, but you can't use them in any way to disrupt the foundation model itself. So you can use OpenAI, but you can't use it in any way to compete against OpenAI. And that's part of their licensing agreement. There's, in fact, a term to that. And you can see the impact that that could have on innovation, that you can have companies that can create innovations that will help sustain the current ecosystem's value chain. But they're not going to invite anyone into their ecosystem that's going to disrupt it. And so they can then be shut out. And that's one that Elon Musk has brought a lawsuit recently alleging OpenAI, limiting the ability, basically organizing a boycott to prevent competitors from using OpenAI financing competitors.
That's the big concern, isn't it?
Yes.
And that is something that also requires some kind of legal framework to prevent against, would you think?
Oh, absolutely. So when we spoke with competition officials, they admitted to us candidly that they missed the last go-around. That the digital economy has certain features that enable winner take most or all. And you have, the 5 firms plus NVIDIA, they have 14% of the world's total market capitalization today. Think about that, 6 firms. Now what you're starting to see is that these GAFAM having multiple levels of the supply chain, and then for the independent foundation models, they have either strategic alliances or financing them. And is that going to compromise their independence? So what are competition officials going to do? And the general rule of thumb is that the agencies are behind, 5 years behind the industry participants. And the courts are generally 5 to 10 years behind the agencies. So even if the agencies bring a challenge, the courts are still thinking about the economy early on. That's changing. Like the United States had a significant victory over Google just this past year. But it's a very slow adjustment in antitrust law. So what India is doing, as well as Europe, is they're trying to jumpstart it with like the sort of Digital Markets Act to give the agencies the tools in order to address these challenges and keep these markets contestable.
Right. But the other challenge that then comes in is that if there's too much of regulation, then does that impact AI as well? How do you balance these concerns of not just keeping a check on it in terms of law, but also too much intervention not spoiling what they were trying to fix in the first place?
Yeah, that's the other thing you hear is that, you know, America innovates and Europe regulates. And there is something to that. And even in America, we have way too many regulations that have outlived their purposes, and that could stifle competition and growth. So it really requires an effort to have an efficient bureaucracy and not have this web of regulations that can then stifle growth. And I think here is like, you can have something like the GDPR, which is very regulatory, but it's going to pose significant cost on smaller firms. Or you can have something more targeted, whereby you can say, give the individuals the right to opt out of behavioral advertising. And then that can change incentives. So you can get market forces to work for you. I think the best regulator is always going to be a healthy, competitive market. It's just aligning incentives so that competition then works to your benefit. Use that as your primary regulator, and then just use the regulations as the sort of guardrails to help then align the competitive forces.
Right. So the government of India is also talking about AI and how it can be used for governance and, good governance practices and, more delivery of faster delivery. What are some of the antitrust concerns that you think government should keep in mind to prevent misuse of AI?
Well, one thing is that there's so many, AI is going to open up so many other legal issues. Like right now you have copyright issues, that artists are now concerned that AI is scraping their artwork, and you can create then like an Andy Warhol picture of us being in, this interview, we can have an Andy Warhol picture of that. And there's the concern about the appropriation of the artist's property. And so you have copyright issues. The antitrust issues will be, I think, primarily involved in innovation and promoting disruptive innovation and preventing the AI supply chain from becoming so concentrated to stifle that. The other issue that we haven't talked about, but it's big in the United States right now, is as more companies are now using pricing algorithms, the pricing algorithms are starting learning how to collude. And how do you then deal with algorithmic collusion by pricing algorithms? And there's a case right now in Tennessee, and it involves throughout the United States, landlords that are now using this one company, RealPage, to set the prices for their apartments. And it's very efficient. And you can imagine each landlord said, yeah, why not have this? Because it's relying on this market data. But what the United States and the private plaintiffs are alleging is that that's having the impact of raising rents above competitive levels, because the algorithm now is taking all of the information from the different landlords and then using it in a way to increase pricing. So prices have gone above competitive levels. And so that's something else to watch out about, is like all of our traditional antitrust concerns now can take a new form with algorithms.
Right. So in a country like India, with this so much of diversity, one of the things that's an area of concern is, of course, the digital divide. So how can AI be democratized so that different socio-economic groups have equal or perhaps a better opportunity at accessing AI?
One belief is that AI can become the equalizer, that if you can't write like it will help you write a better paper or better cover letter. It can help present your resume in a better way, right? So in some ways that it could provide those benefits. And this is like, when you think about what is going to be the value added of humans going forward, then there might not be as much of an educational divide as an emotional intelligence divide. Is the ability to have empathy, the ability to communicate with others and to understand. That seems to be not something that's going to be displaced by AI anytime soon. So maybe then education overall is going to change, and it's not going to be the sort of heavily quantitative analysis that might be taken over more by AI, but more sort of the ability then to talk with other individuals, creativity, those might be the areas. And so in terms of, it could be a leveling opportunity, because now it creates a gateway for individuals to maybe develop those aspects in their education going forward.
One of the other concerns at the intersection of technology and law enforcement currently in India is this huge issue of digital arrest, where a scamster poses as a policeman and then tells people they've been arrested online, while there's absolutely no legal sanctity to it. But there have been a lot of people who've been defrauded of huge sums of money. Prime Minister Modi spoke about it, saying, to try and raise awareness about this issue. So what are some of the safeguards that we can take to prevent this, because it's pretty widespread currently in India?
Well, that goes back to sort of watermarking. And, any market economy is going to rely on trust. That you cannot have a market economy that's not developed on trust. And once you lose trust, that can have serious implications on the government as well as on the economy overall. So how do you maintain that trust in AI? And that's what your issue points to. Because now, if you don't know if that's actually a government official or a fraud, that can have significant implications. So I think there we're going to need to have some governmental as well as, basically a consensus with AI, the developers of AI, and the government to have some sort of watermarking feature to eliminate that fraud, so that when you know that you're dealing with an actual government official as opposed to a fraudster. Because without that, then there are far greater implications that can have on your economy and your democracy.
Right. As we were discussing earlier, Australia is bringing in a law as far as, children not being able to access social media up till a certain age. Very, very serious issues of child safety, of privacy that this really throws up. Do you think that this is a very important step, and do you see this being replicated in different jurisdictions, different countries, and how important this particular issue is?
I know that Australia, and they've been very active in this space for a while. And, I presented some of my earlier research, and they were very interested early on with that. And so they're very much at the vanguard with this. Whether or not a complete ban is necessary, I think that's going to be debated. Can we have social media in a way that can be safe for children without totally banning it? That's going to be the policy issue. Well, that's also going to depend on having the guardrails that we talked about earlier.
Right.
Is the ability to eliminate behavioral advertising. The ability, if a place like Facebook is rewarded for attention, then giving that to a child is dangerous. And I think here we're going to need to have either a ban, or it's going to be then significant changes in the way that the economic incentives of the platform, basically changing those economic incentives.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Maurice Stucke, for joining us on Bennett University Thought Leaders in this edition of it, and breaking down all of these emerging aspects of technology and law enforcement, and perhaps the roadmap ahead. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.